One morning, a Florida farmer stumbled across dozens of strange leathery eggs tucked under an old stump. At first, he thought it was just harmless wildlife. But when they hatched, what crawled out forced him to shut down his entire farm immediately. You won't believe what was hiding beneath his land. Stay with us to hear the full, unbelievable story. If you love true life mysteries that unfold in the most unexpected ways, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more. It was early spring in northern Florida, the kind of morning where the dew clung stubbornly to the grass, and the air still carried a hint of winter's hush. The sun, just beginning to lift itself over the horizon, cast long shadows across the fields of Rick Harmon's farm. Birds stirred gently in the trees, and the faint scent of damp earth mixed with pine lingered in the breeze. Rick was a man of the land, 63 years old, weathered like the planks of his old barn, and quiet in the way men become after decades of solitude and hard work. He had worked this land for over 30 years, cattle, vegetables, a few citrus trees near the south fence line. And in all that time, nothing much had ever surprised him. But that morning, something caught his eye. Near the edge of the pond, just beyond a fallen tree stump, was a mound of thick vegetation, unusual, tightly packed, as if someone or something had built it with care. Rick paused, adjusted his worn baseball cap, and walked toward it, the dirt soft beneath his boots. Kneeling beside the mound, he brushed away a layer of damp leaves and froze. There, nestled like secrets beneath the forest's breath, were eggs, dozens of them. Leathery, dark, unlike anything he'd seen on his farm before. They weren't chicken, weren't duck. They were wild, untamed, and yet oddly deliberate in how they were hidden. He straightened slowly, eyes scanning the surrounding trees, the glistening surface of the pond. The quiet now felt watchful. Most would have dismissed them. Rick, though, had a reverence for living things, born from years of understanding that nature does not make mistakes. He fetched small flags from his truck and marked the spots around the mound, careful not to disturb anything further. "Let them be," he muttered to himself, heading back to the barn. Whatever they are, they were here first. He didn't know it then, but in that moment his entire life was beginning to shift. 3 days passed. The sky had turned gray and swollen with the promise of rain, and the pond near Rick's property had grown restless, rippling even when the wind was still. He hadn't returned to the nest right away. Something about it had lingered in his chest like a whisper he didn't yet understand. But that morning, just after dawn, he felt pulled, compelled by some quiet instinct, to check the flags he'd planted. With coffee still warm in a thermos and a knitted flannel jacket wrapped around him, Rick walked the path back toward the tree stump, his boots soft against the moss. As he approached, the air changed. It was thicker, humid. The kind of humidity that clung to the skin made the hairs on your arms rise. Birds were strangely silent. Even the frogs by the pond, normally a chorus of chatter, had gone still. Then he saw them. The mound had moved, the leaves were scattered, the soil upturned, and among the tangle of broken shell and damp earth, tiny creatures squirmed. Dozens of them, their movements slow but deliberate, like shadows learning to breathe. Rick stepped closer, kneeling again, more cautiously this time. At first glance, the hatchlings could have been mistaken for lizards. But no, These were something else entirely, small, scaled, eyes unblinking, and jaws lined with the kind of teeth that belonged to another time. Alligators. A cold pulse of dread moved through him. He staggered backward, heart pounding now with a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. These weren't just a few eggs. This was a nesting ground. And if the babies were here, so were the mothers. He didn't wait. Sprinting faster than he had in years, Rick made it back to the farmhouse and locked the door behind him. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, not because of the creatures themselves, but because he understood what they meant. This land, his land, was no longer just his. And sometimes when the wild comes knocking, the only choice is to step aside. The phone rang only once before the line picked up. Rick's voice was steady but low. "This is Rick Harmon. I've got hatchlings, dozens, alligators, near my pond." There was a long pause on the other end, then a voice, calm, methodical, but laced with concern. "Mr. Harmon, I'm going to need you to step away from the area. Stay indoors. We'll send a wildlife team immediately." He hung up, the silence in the room pressing in like the heavy Florida air outside. Rick sat down at the kitchen table, the wood grain smooth beneath his calloused fingers. For a long time he just stared out the window toward the barn, where his cattle were still grazing, oblivious. This farm had been his world. Every fence post, every trough, every ridge in the soil had passed through his hands. It was more than a livelihood. It was memory, legacy. The place where his wife had planted her daffodils near the porch swing before she passed. The fields where his grandchildren chased fireflies each summer. And now, it was something else entirely. Within the hour, 2 trucks rolled in, marked with state wildlife insignia. Men and women in uniform stepped out with quiet urgency, scanning the tree line with trained eyes. Rick met them by the gate, jaw clenched. "They're just off the pond, near the old cedar stump." One of the officers nodded. "We've seen this before. Nesting females sometimes travel inland if they find undisturbed land. The stumps, the soil, your pond, it's perfect for them." "Perfect for them," Rick echoed, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "And what about my cattle, my workers?" The officer looked down, then back up. "They're at risk, sir. Hatchlings attract predators, and the mothers, they're likely still close. Territorial, protective." There was no need for further explanation. Rick didn't argue, didn't complain. Just nodded slowly, took off his hat, and stared across the fields, his fields. "I'll shut it down," he said. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from something deeper. A quiet sorrow that only comes from letting go of something you thought would last forever. As the officers began their work, Rick turned back toward the house, each step heavier than the last. Somewhere in the distance, a baby gator let out a high-pitched grunt, so small, yet so final. That day the land changed hands, not through a sale or a will, but through surrender. Not to man, not to time, but to nature claiming what was always hers. For the first time in 32 years, Rick's farm sat still. The tractors were parked, the fields lay untouched. No cattle wandered the pastures, no hands hauled feed or mended wire. It was as if the land itself had taken a breath, one long, ancient exhale. Rick stood on the back porch, a thermos cooling in his hand, watching the early light spread across the misty fields. A fine layer of fog drifted just above the grass, softening every edge, as if the earth didn't want to be seen too clearly just yet. In that stillness he listened, not for machinery or men or market prices, but for the hum beneath it all. The frogs returning to their chorus near the pond, the rustle of wind through the trees, and yes, the low, distant grunt of gator young still waiting to be relocated. Rick didn't resent them, not anymore. At first he had, quietly, stubbornly. The idea of halting the work of his life because of a few wild creatures had felt humiliating, even violating. But the longer the quiet stretched, the more he began to see. This land had a memory far older than his own. Before him there had been no fences, no barns, just trees, sky, and creatures moving as they were meant to. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a loss. Maybe it was a reminder that the ground beneath his boots wasn't his to own, not really. That nature, no matter how long it slept, could still wake and rewrite the rules. He thought of his father, who'd taught him how to till and plant by watching the birds, not the almanac. Of his grandfather, who used to say, "If the earth changes her mind, you best learn how to listen." Rick was beginning to understand what that meant now. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, eyes fixed on the tree line. Somewhere out there, the wildlife officers were still working. Careful, respectful. They hadn't killed the creatures, just moved them. Gave them space to be what they were. It was more mercy than most people offered. And Rick, for all his years, found a strange peace in that. The weeks passed like slow-moving clouds, quiet and unhurried. With the farm operation still on pause, Rick found himself waking up before dawn out of habit, but with nowhere urgent to be. The first few mornings he sat on the porch swing, staring out over the empty fields. But by the end of the second week he started walking again. Down to the pond, along the gravel drive, past the silent barn. He began noticing things he hadn't in years, like how the wildflowers had returned along the fence posts, their petals trembling in the early light, or how the birds had built a nest right above the old feed-room door, or how the land, unburdened by machines and boots, had started to breathe differently, fuller, softer. One morning, while standing near the same cedar stump where the eggs had first been found, Rick saw tracks in the mud. Not alligator this time, but a child's. Small bare feet. He followed them up the ridge and found Sarah, his 8-year-old granddaughter, crouched in the grass with a notebook in hand, sketching a heron by the waterline. She looked up wide-eyed. "Sorry, Grandpa, I didn't mean to sneak off. I like it here." He smiled, surprised. "You came all the way down here by yourself?" She nodded. "Mom said we could visit while school's out. I wanted to draw the pond before you fix everything again." Rick sat beside her, easing down with the slow care of a man whose knees had seen too many winters. "I don't think I'm going to fix it," he said, his voice gentle. "Not the way it was." Sarah tilted her head. "Why not?" He looked out across the still water. "Because maybe it doesn't need fixing. Maybe it needs listening." That was the first time he said it aloud, not to the wildlife officers, not to his neighbors, but to himself. The farm wouldn't go back to the way it was. Instead, he began to imagine something new. A sanctuary, perhaps, a place where the land could be shared. Wildlife corridors, native planting, maybe even guided tours for school kids who'd never heard frogs sing at dusk. He still had his hands, his tools, his know-how. But now he had something else. perspective, purpose that wasn't rooted in yield per acre or cattle weight, but in balance, in healing. He knew it wouldn't bring in the same money, but some things, the important ones, aren't measured in profit. They're measured in the way a grandchild's eyes light up at a heron's wingspan, or how a piece of land, long burdened, finally gets to rest. It wasn't anything grand, just a few folding chairs beneath the oak tree near the pond, a pot of chili simmering over a propane burner, and a cooler full of sweet tea and lemonade. But to Rick, it felt monumental. It was late May now, and the heat had crept in for good. Fireflies were beginning to blink through the brush, and the sky was stretched in wide bands of lavender and gold. The pond, once a place of hidden danger, shimmered peacefully under the fading light. A handful of neighbors had come, most out of curiosity. A couple from down the road who'd once bought eggs from Rick every spring. A biology teacher from the middle school who'd heard about the gator farm that turned into a haven. Two grandkids who were more interested in catching frogs than listening to grown-ups talk. And then Sarah, of course, sitting cross-legged with her sketch pad now full of birds, branches, and dreams. Rick stood a little apart at first, hands in his pockets, watching as people wandered the paths he'd cleared. There were new signs now, wooden markers with names like Egret Bend and Turtle Point. The wildlife officers had even helped him build a small dock for safe viewing. He wasn't used to sharing his space. For so long the farm had been a place of work, routine, quiet labor. Now it was something else, a place of wonder, of education, of reverence. The biology teacher approached, shaking his hand warmly. "I've never seen anything like it, Rick. You've created a real learning sanctuary here." Rick shrugged, eyes soft. "I didn't create it, I just got out of the way." The man laughed gently. "Still, most folks wouldn't have." As the sky darkened, Rick took a seat beside Sarah, who offered him her sketchbook. The page she'd just finished showed him, silhouetted against the tree line, standing alone, tall and still. "You drew me?" he asked. She grinned. "You looked like part of the land." That did something to his chest, a kind of ache, a kind of healing. As fireflies rose and voices quieted, Rick looked around at the people gathered, their eyes wide, their steps careful. And he realized something simple, something he hadn't understood even a few months ago. You don't always protect a legacy by building it bigger. Sometimes you protect it by opening the gate and letting others walk the same quiet path you once did. Not for profit, not for pride, but for the peace it brings. And on that warm night, as laughter and crickets filled the air, Rick Harmon knew his farm hadn't ended. It had only just begun.